What's up, everyone? Welcome to Let's Talk Markets. I am your host, Pink, here with my co-host, Mr. Dave Lauer, and a special guest today, Justin Slaughter, Policy Director at Paradigm. Justin, Dave, how y'all doing?
Doing good, Pink. How are you? How's it down in, down south? Kind of hot?
It's hot. It's hot girl summer here in like a lot of ways. Because like Barbie comes out tomorrow, so that's it's right. Like, it's hot girl summer in that way. By the time this posts, I'll probably already have seen Barbie like twice. Or I might be watching Oppenheimer. I'm feeling the Barbenheimer vibe.
I'm excited for Oppenheimer.
That's a good life goal. Yeah. I mean, I'm definitely looking to those people. I wish I had this much time. Who bought the double matinee like Wednesday night and were out in the theater like 6 in the morning, I think. Good to be here. Thanks for having me. It's hot here in Bethesda, Maryland too. Just it's a balmy 87.
All right.
Bless your heart.
Up here in Canada, I was wearing a hoodie earlier today. The weather is just about perfect, and I was just saying this on a call earlier. Like for the 2 weeks of the year that we can say that, we just rub it in as much as possible.
Honestly, they
have to. Yeah. Got to take those wins.
No, not down here. My Pink is running like Rudy Giuliani here, so I gotta.
I lived in Seattle for a year, man, back at the start of my career. And like every day it was brutal. Then people said, just stick around, Sure enough, July, like, this is why you live here the other 11 months of the year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Like, we put up with the craziest winters here. I mean, the craziest winters. I can't even, you can't overstate. I will, this is how crazy. At minus 37, okay, you might not know this, but Fahrenheit and Celsius converge. And generally, you only know that if you've experienced minus 37, which I have.
The level where you throw
You're
water.
Blowing my redneck mind here, Dave.
Yeah, we did that. We were like, oh, let's try that boiling water thing. It worked. It was crazy. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Forget about it. So now, like in the summer, you tolerate it. I mean, we ski a lot, so that's nice. But you tolerate it because then in the summer, it's just beautiful until the wildfires hit. But that's not an issue for us right now. So. We're outside. We're loving it. Yeah, but Justin, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you. We were just reminiscing before this about how far back you and I had been in touch, all the way back to I did this presentation at the CFTC's Technology Advisory Committee in like 2014.
That's right.
That was a long time ago. Just when I was just getting started in all of this regulatory stuff.
It is so funny because I now am on TAC, right, in all my spare time. We had a meeting yesterday, and some things have changed. You talk about crypto now, you talk about AI, but some things have not, which is cybersecurity. We were talking about it then. Everybody we're all dead, right? But I remember that presentation.
Right. Yep. And I was, it was also about market surveillance, market manipulation. These will be topics forever.
The work's never done, right? Because it's kind of a red queen race where technology happens, there's a lag, there's a response to the response, and on we go. And the only solution is to play.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really speaks to the importance of staying involved, staying active, and understanding what's going on, because it's ever changing.
I think what CFTC does with the TAC is a really good thing. I mean, I thought what the SEC did with MSAC, with the Equity Market Structure Advisory Committee, was a really good thing. And the Investor Advisory Committee, which is still around because it has to be, right, as opposed to MSAC, which was just a couple of years. But it's a shame. I think regulators and industry collaborating closely is the only way that you'll get decent regulation. But I also think regulators should be engaging with more than just the largest industry firms, of course, right?
Back when I worked for Sharon Bowen, we were starting up the MREC for the first time. And one thing that I really stress is the importance of having stakeholders that did not only represent an industry or an industry group, but also represent ordinary users. I mean, I continue to fantasize, in fact, about not just a stakeholder group, but actual regular user serving more directly on these advisory committees, including at SEC. So often I found, right, that those of us who live in the Beltway, we speak for people, but it's important even more to have people speak for themselves. I continually talk about how important it was when I worked for Sharon Bowen for us to go out to farmers who lived out in western Missouri and eastern Kansas and just talk to them about how technology was changing their lives, and also about how they were responding to things like algo trading, how they were responding to things like the rise of the Title VII reforms. And I still believe that. The best data you get comes from actually talking to, regular people and not just those weirdos like us who live in DC and work on this full time.
No, man, you're preaching to the choir here. I mean, like, I got to tell you, my eyes were opened over the last couple of years just talking to individual investors, right? And coming from the professional trading side, the institutional asset management side, working with exchanges, you don't ever really interact with an actual individual investor who's buying, a couple stocks because they love a company or because they're investing for their retirement. And it's just an amazingly different perspective. And it's both important, but it's important to hear people and hear what their experience is. But it's also important to understand that when some companies hold themselves out as advocating for this group, this audience, they're not always doing that, right? They're usually advocating for their bottom line, and often there are conflicts there. So I just think that's a great idea. Obviously we think that individual investors need to be part of these conversations. We've led, campaigns to get thousands of comment letters filed on the equity market structure reform issues and a couple of other, regulations around transparency that we think are very important. And, I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah. So anyway.
Well, last week we did promise everyone that we would take a good hard look at the recent decision from U.S. District Judge Annalisa Torres, which is the reason we're all here to talk about SEC versus Ripple. So that's where we're at. We were going to take a good hard look into it. The truth is it's very perplexing. So we decided we're just going to bail. And the rest of this podcast is going to be a ranking of the best Keanu Reeves movies in order of their greatest influence on humanity. So,
Speed.
And if
Speed's definitely number one for that.
It's obviously Bill and Ted.
It's obviously Bill and
Speed
Ted.
followed by John Wick, followed by Bill and Ted, number 3. But that's
number 3. What a low blow!
Hey, listen, I gotta tell you.
No, but I will tell you. Right, Ripple is very much like Keanu, and it's a slow burn. You wouldn't have expected that this case would be as significant as it was when it launched, and then you look back and like, wow, that really changed a lot of legislation, regulation, and cinema.
Yeah. Right.
Definitely.
There you go. Who would have thought Bill and Ted would have that effect?
I think we have to be excellent to each other, right? That's just the way to live. But we all forgot the Matrix.
Yeah.
So.
Look, I've been fortunate enough to get to know Alex Winter recently. He did a documentary. I'm going to plug this documentary for a second called The YouTube Effect. It just came out. I'm in it, so check it out. I think it's pretty cool, and I think he is the kind of person who would really appreciate the fact that we're talking about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure in a conversation about crypto and Ripple.
Definitely.
It's funny, right? But there's a time travel element too, because I like to say part of the issue with crypto is it has a incredible cyclical ability, and I mean that both in terms of the markets, but also in terms of the degree to which every 4 years people in DC forget that crypto is going to be a thing. And then there's kind of an explosion that prompts people to go back to it. And I've lived through a couple of these cycles now. I'm like, I don't think it's, solved. You got to go deal with it. And it'll
pretty wild,
fix
right?
itself.
These cycles are crazy. I mean, so I've been in crypto from the beginning. I'm proud to say I bought Bitcoin in 2010. That's when this started. I was in high frequency, and a guy on the desk was like, "Hey, you ever hear of this thing?" And I was like, "Oh, that's cool." And then I bought some just so I could. I mean, not much, and I sold it way too early because it was part of one of those cycles. And it went crazy, crashed, went crazy, crashed, and every time it's been sort of something slightly different, right? That has led and popped the bubble. And I think from a technological perspective, look, I'm a pretty big nerd, and I love the tech. I love all this, so much about it. I love the transparency of it, and the decentralization. I'm someone who probably leans towards this is the future of money versus this is a glorified database, and that tends to be the two camps that you often find. And I think you're probably in that camp with me.
I am. I mean, I look at it, and for me, it's everyone has their epiphany moment. Mine came, I was checking into a hotel in 2021, and I followed Bitcoin and all of crypto before that. I was first learning about it when I was a Hill staffer in 2012, and I was an honest person. So I was like, I can't, buy this because I'm regulating stuff related to it. So that would be, dishonest. And I regret that a little bit.
Oh yeah.
But I kept following it, right? When I was at CFTC, we did the Terra case and the coin flip case where Bitcoin was held to be a commodity for the first time over a claim of like improper advertising regarding one exchange and what it was doing. And then I remember leaving the CFTC in 17 and, saying to people, there should really be an effort to get this kind of, create a regulatory regime because there's clearly going to grow from this. And interest in that died away when the price of Bitcoin and Ether crashed at the end of 17.
But that's what keeps
and
happening.
Then
right?
it keeps happening. It's that consistent cycle. But for me, the thing that really, was the epiphany was I was checking this hotel and I bought my room in Expedia. I check in and I get told your card was declined. I say, not possible. I paid, on Expedia. You got to call Expedia. So I call up Expedia and the guy says to me, I see the problem. Put your phone on the dais and put me on speaker. So I do that. And the person's like, hey, this is X with Expedia. Hi, is Y with, Hilton. Card was declined. Yes. What's the last four of the card? And he reads it out and I say, that's not my card. And the Expedia rep said, no, sir, when you buy a room with Expedia, we charge your card first and then we pay for your room with our own credit card.
Their card.
There's 2 rounds of credit card fees on this one transaction. And like, yeah. And I'm like, what a great use case for crypto as just a minor example. I screamed about this for 3 days. My wife said to me, stop talking about this. It's not that interesting. I'm like, but it is interesting. It's like, there's all these little elements of inefficiency built in that are just rent seeking. And there's a way to cut through that and, get more money to people. I mean, I saw it just the other day. We were having some work done in our house and the guy was, can you please write a check to me, rather than a credit card company, because the fees would just eat him for several percent.
Yeah.
The world we live in is filled with all these things you don't think about, but this adds up very quickly over time. And that's part of the appeal to me of crypto is the competition of it.
For sure. I mean, and, look, a part of that is you find a lot of political corruption in so many different places. And you find, I think your point about competition is absolutely the thing that underlies so much of this, right? Because if you have incumbents, concentrated incumbents in industries who have a lot of lobbying power and a lot of political control, they're going to do everything they can to maintain that rent-seeking system. And you'd have to overcome that, and it's practically impossible in the way that the U.S. political system is set up right now.
This is exactly right. And like the danger we have is that at best you have a system of like the incumbents rise up and they're popped down, and new incumbents rise up, we repeat the system. And that beats letting incumbents rule forever. But even better would be build systems that make it so that decentralization means nobody gets that powerful, and thereby you have a reduction in that political risk that requires that activity. I mean, I've been working on this concept. I'm a strong progressive. I worked for Ed Markey. I worked for Sharon Bowen, for Alison Lee. I mean, I'm working on a piece with another person about how decentralization is a progressive value at core because of that, And I think about every great social movement is in history decentralized. It's very rare that like one great man leads things in a good direction. Power comes up from the people.
I think it's now we're going into politics, so we'll do this briefly.
We got to get back to Ripple, right? I know.
Yeah, but I think it might be a progressive concept, and I would probably argue it's actually as well a conservative concept. I think the problem that you've seen is the two political parties aren't really in line with those systems of thinking. They've both trended towards corporatism, right? And it is very much not a corporatist philosophy, right?
Right. I mean,
which pushes for centralization, incumbency, and corporate concentration of power. So, I think if you are into crypto, you probably are very much somebody who believes in grassroots, power of the people type of thing. I think you can come at that in a very bipartisan. Like, I don't think that you need to have a political philosophy on one side. I think as long as you're not a corporatist.
I think that's right. I think it's the idea of the freedom of people to choose their own passion, passion and fashion. So
yeah. So all right. So look, we're here because something pretty earth-shattering in the world of crypto regulation legislation happened last week. It hits all sorts of different things that we often talk about on the podcast and that we pay attention to with, in our company. So, maybe can you give like just a brief overview, what happened, what the decision was, and what you think the impacts are going to be?
So I'm going to try to make this real brief. So stop me if this gets long-winded. So Ripple was a case that started actually in the last day of then SEC Chair Jay Clayton's tenure as chair of the SEC. And Ripple was a company that did their own initial coin offering several years ago in the previous decade. And they made it available to, institutional investors. They made it available to retail investors. They gave it to their own employees as compensation. And the claim the SEC made when they sued Ripple on December 22nd, 2020, is that they engaged in illegal securities action.
And that was Jay Clayton, SEC. They brought that.
It was Jay Clayton. It was his last day. The next day, you had Alad Roisman take over as acting chair, and then on January 20th, you had Democrats take over. But so it persisted over 4 chairmen. But it was started by Clayton. It was finished by Chair Gensler. And the basic issue, right, is that most times when the SEC sues a company, there's a settlement. The SEC doesn't really have a model of doing a lot of lawsuits, especially against big companies. That's a long-standing issue we can discuss. Jesse Eisinger's written about this.
Yep.
But in this case, there was no settlement. There was basically the idea the SEC was going to go to court. And I was told by somebody that the theory here was, a lot of crypto companies we think are securities. If we show we beat Ripple, then everybody's going to kind of understand we're in control. And the danger is what happens if you lose. And that's kind of what happened in many ways. It was a very big bet, and then the bet didn't pay off. And now the SEC's position is weakened. So what happened is that both sides did several years discovery. They spent a lot of money on it, the SEC and Ripple. And the judge, who's Annalise Torres in the Southern District of New York, had the case. And she did what's known as a motion for summary judgment. This is where both parties say, we agree on the facts, but as a matter of law, you should vote with us. And she said, on most issues that she had enough facts, or the facts were not in dispute. So under the law, she said, the SEC wins on some points, Ripple wins on others. And the punchline is that the biggest issue was the SEC lost on the part that matters most to everything else for crypto. And I'll explain how. So the first step is that the judge went through and applied the famous Howey test. This is from 1946. It involves a case where someone was selling interest in an orange grove and saying these are securities. And you have to do, I think, a 3-prong test. Some would say it's 4. I think it's 3. An investment of money in a common enterprise where you expect the efforts of others to make you a profit.
Right.
And the judge analogized that, okay, there was investment of money, and there was clearly, a common enterprise. For the times Ripple sold to companies, I find that there was an expectation of profits because there were these contracts with the big institutional investors that said, you're going to work with you're buying XRP, which is the token. You're going to work with Ripple, so you can understand that we are, clearly going to work with the token to make the network grow. And she said, okay, there were security sales to these institutional investors. But then she applied the test to retail investors and found that there was not a, expectation of profits, because a lot of the people who bought XRP on exchanges just bought it and didn't know they were even buying from Ripple. They might not even know Ripple existed. There was never the kind of knowledge base that led to an expectation that people were relying on Ripple.
So I'm going to make a disclosure here.
Yeah.
I was a programmatic buyer.
That's the line she used, that people are programmatic buyers because they use algorithms too.
I don't know what she's talking about. I bought some Ripple once, some XRP, right? So, and as a retail investor, I was buying lots of cryptos, selling lots of cryptos. It was a great time. It was the Wild West. A lot of people were having fun. Lots of questions about how you'd report it, if so, on tax returns. But that, all that aside, this is where the decision really confused me. And maybe just I'm biased, or maybe I was actually paying attention to what I was buying. But I knew Ripple existed, and I knew the value of XRP was tied towards their ability to make that, get that accepted as a money transfer unit by financial institutions, right? Like this.
And this is a key point. This is a key point, right? Because the judge said there might be people like you that really know this, but I'm looking at a reasonable person based on all the facts. And to me, it's not proven that this was true. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but it's not proven enough as a matter of law. There's vagueness there. And partly that's because, right, this gets to the core nature of what a token actually is. The SEC's argument was tokens are always securities, basically, except for the example of Bitcoin, they're always securities. And what a lot of people are arguing is, well, that's not true, right? Because that's kind of like saying the orange in the Howey case is a security. An orange is an orange. It's a commodity at base. And then you can have, investment contracts based off of that. So part of the reason here we have this decision is that most people just, there's this very clear-cut pathway for if you're offering securities as securities, you're going to IPO, you go through this very well-worn path, and never is a question.
Right.
But if you don't, there's this model of, is it an investment contract under Howey, and to prove this element. And the judge basically was saying, I don't find that XRP is always an investment contract. I find that there's a token, and then sometimes there can be investment contracts on the token, but that's a second order issue. But it leads to all of these unexpected outcomes where you have securities, when you're selling to the institutional investors, but not securities you're selling to the programmatic retail investors. So this is what I call an example of how when you let things, go be decided for policy by the judges, things can get unexpected. And probably why the solution here is for legislation to come in, because Congress can say, look, this is, whatever this is, we're going to call it Y. It may not be Y, we're going to call it Y. I've got a shoe here. My shoe is an article of clothing. I'm just declaring that. Someone say, well, no, a shoe's not really an article of clothing. It kind of is. Like, no, we're saying under the law, it's an article of clothing. It's a shoe. Judges can't do that. Judges are limited to trying to argue by analogy.
Right.
And so in this case, right, when it works, then you have, a system of precedent. But when it fails and you have this big regulatory gap open up, and the only solution really, other than years and years of more litigation, where you probably are getting additional cases that are wins and additional cases that are losses and these bigger gaps opening, is for legislation to come in and just answer all these hard questions.
Yeah, I think I think that's right. I think that's absolutely spot on, which the problem is that there was no and has been no legislation. There is a legitimate disagreement amongst, fairly well-educated people as to, what is this thing? And it's a tough thing to understand because it's like, on one hand, it's a sequence of alphanumeric characters, and on the other, it has a lot of characteristics of what you would think is a security, right? Because it is priced, it has a secondary and primary market, it is tied to, generally speaking, the success of an enterprise, although that enterprise might be decentralized and open source, but it might not because most of them aren't, right? And so it's a really confusing thing. And then and it seems like now it's even more confusing because it's a security here. It's not one here. Right. There's an investment contract here.
It's constantly changing in Protean. That's part of the issue, right? Because if you have to go through and say every single sale we're going to do this analysis is not workable. At that point, it becomes something that's just an exercise almost of utility. People are constantly changing. These things are always moving around. It's funny, right? Because I've often called this like a really funny shaped peg as crypto is that it's kind of a bit of a, some say it's a duck, some say it's, not a duck. A person who is neither pro nor anti-crypto said it's a platypus. It's got features of both these things.
Right.
And that makes for really difficult calls. And usually, right, that's where you go to Congress as the elected representatives of the people, because we don't have national referendum, and you let them say, okay, we're going to decide whether or not, this is one thing versus something else.
Right.
And I think that's, in fact, part of the reason we're going to see that now, because a lot of people, there were a lot of other parts of the Ripple case, one of which was whether or not there was this concept of fair notice. And if the judge had made it about fair notice and this idea that, Ripple uniquely was told you're not a security, it's okay, that wouldn't really apply to many other companies because very few have had that kind of back and forth with the SEC that Ripple had. But by doing it in this way on the programmatic sales, you can say, well, that applies now to every other exchange offered token, especially ones where they exchanged didn't offer it themselves, didn't create the token themselves. And that is a big problem because the focus of the SEC has been to go after the exchanges. If you can't go after the exchanges, the whole litigation strategy fails.
For sure. Yeah. And does this, and part of my fear is that this could really open the floodgates to fraud on the one hand, right? Because now you have given essentially the roadmap for how to not be considered a security. And while we have this sort of gap in the market that no one still knows, like whose responsibility is it to regulate and enforce here? Do you think this is a big problem, especially for individual investors?
I really worry about the effects of this overall if we don't act. I mean, I part of why I got into financial reform in the first place in the Congress, at CFTC, at SEC, was seeing the events from deregulating the swaps market in 1999, 2000, and then leading to the financial crisis, right? That was a congressional and Clinton admin deregulation.
Yep.
It's not only Congress that can deregulate. The courts can and have deregulated things as well. And you don't want to leave it such that there are big gaps that the worst actors in the world flood into. Right. You know, you want to reward the good actors. You want to make it so that people who want to follow the rules, that want to, you know, innovate in a safe way are rewarded, and not make it a race of just whoever's the fastest, because then people will start doing things that are not good to other people.
Yeah, that's right. You know, I think that's a serious problem, and it's why I said, and you know, and many others said that this decision is, and look, she might be right. I'm not sort of arguing the law, but it still feels a bit backwards, because the point of securities laws, the point of designating something as security, is you get a lot of protection, right? You fall under a regulatory regime and enforcement regime that's well understood and well trod. And one of the biggest concerns, I think, that people have right now is when you call it a security, when it's being marketed and sold to institutions, and not when just the average person is buying it on an exchange. Are we protecting the sophisticated investors and now not protecting the people that can be most victimized and have the most to lose from fraud in this market?
And this is where, right, that like, this is a very much kind of the ultimate lawyer brain mindset, is that if the law makes you follow in a way that you wouldn't expect, judges are almost powerless to change course, right? I actually thought that's a very potent argument, but it's a policy argument. And judges rarely weight policy arguments very heavily, especially lower courts. In the Supreme Court, you can get them weighting that argument heavily. But, you know, this Supreme Court, I think, is not going to look at it and say, oh, this is a new area, and to make sure we're going to maintain the view of the SEC, we're going to have really, you know, I think if anything, it'd probably be the reverse. I mean, I think looking at trying to address regulation through the courts strikes me as probably not as good as going to Congress in general, but especially dangerous.
Do you think that the SEC was I don't know if you can say wrong in how they pursued this, but you know, like they looked at it and they saw a security, right? Like you say, like a platypus, right? They see the bill and they're like, that's a duck. And on the other side, they're like, no, it's clearly not a duck. If you think it's a duck, then you say, we have the tools we need. This is our purview. We need to go after this. Did they do it right? Could they have done this better? Maybe it's easy to say in retrospect, but
it's always easy to say my quarterback, but I definitely think, you know, the mistake was shifting from saying we need legislation, which the SEC said back in May of 2021, to saying we don't need legislation. I think that was the critical mistake. And if there'd been legislation, right, that the SEC could have been involved in writing before this, you know, the case would have been mooted, right? And I think, in fact, that's the thing that is really the mistake, is leaning away from the possibility of legislation when there were a lot of opportunities for that. And not everybody, you know, in the admin took that position, but I think that's the real mistake.
Do you think that we're in the kind of political environment that you can get good legislation?
I mean, I'm a pretty big fan of the CHIPS Act, personally. I think that was a pretty good bill.
Yep.
I think in this case, right, legislation happens these days when both parties decide they want something out of it. And I think you could have gotten some pretty good stuff, you know, that was win-win for everybody. But now I think it may be harder to get because you have this case hanging out there than it would have been, say, even 6 months ago.
Yeah. And then, you know, if you think about FTX and the fallout from that as well, when that happened, you saw more polarization, I think, than what you saw pre-FTX, where it felt like things were maybe, from a congressional perspective, a lot of people were saying very similar things on both sides. You had the extremes, but now it feels like there's a lot less of that.
And I think that's right. I think you're going to see a bit of a pullback, maybe even more than, you know, if it swung in one direction because of FTX, I think now it may swing back even more so, because that was an event and this is a legal case. But I do think that gets to the key point, right, which is that I think there have been several times you could have seen legislation that was bipartisan pop up between basically 2017 and the present day. And the longer we wait, the worse this gets in terms of, you know, how hard it gets, you know, the more complicated the questions. I'm a big believer, therefore, in triage, like try to act in a way to staunch the bleeding, solve problems, because I don't think anybody's happy with this setup, and we're just all kind of continuing to grind on through this morass.
Right.
We all know we have to do. Just I think there's resistance to doing it, which is big bipartisan legislation.
Are there any current efforts that you're optimistic about in terms of legislation?
I am. I mean, I saw, Senators Lummis and Gillibrand re-released their bill, added 100 pages to it, in response to a lot of the events of 2022, one of which was proof of reserves, for instance, being required. Another part of it was attestations. Another part was fees to fund the CFTC. I mean, I big, at CFTC, as we, you and I talked about this in the past, CFTC is smaller than the SEC, largely not because of any specific reason that they didn't have a funding stream that was independent of the appropriations process. And that was in part because of the aggressive lobbying of very large financial futures exchanges during Dodd-Frank. This is a great chance to actually resolve that. And then hopefully, have the full power to go after not just, nascent spaces, but also the swaps markets.
Wouldn't that be ironic, right? Because all these crypto companies that want the CFTC to have purview, probably because they're a lot smaller and less aggressive and active. And this could be the thing that ends up being
I actually think it's not even that. I think for a lot of them, it's CFTC was the first one to do it. I mean, for me personally, I look at part of why I think CFTC is better is SEC has a huge agenda, right? You have ESG, you have DEI, you have GameStop. We still haven't dealt with anything really out of that. Market structure. You have money market mutual funds, which continue to be, elements. You have everything around executive comp. CFTC's agenda is really light. And so between the fact that CFTC started engaging on crypto before SEC did with the coin flip case of 2015, Terra case, they have kind of a full, agenda that's open. And also, like I say this a lot, SEC still didn't finish its Dodd-Frank rules. 10 years on, they're still working on them.
It's crazy.
CFTC got it done. And some people would say that's uniquely because of the powers of the previous chair, but having been there after him, I'll tell you, the staff's really good at getting things done in a really, aggressive manner.
That's funny, man. So that I do think that I think your thought is this really could potentially help the CFTC, that this could really bolster it, provide it the funding it needs, and put it in that position to have authority and oversight over the entire crypto market? Or do you think this ends up sort of bifurcating into securities and non-securities?
I mean, I think probably at the end of the day, I've yet to see a bill that really does do some kind of slicing. There are different mechanisms for it on Capitol Hill. There's this system in the McHenry-Thompson bill where you go through, you start life as security, you metamorphosize into a commodity. There's the Lummis-Gillibrand, which takes an X and says if you hit these qualifications, you're a commodity. If not, you're a security. Other people do something else. As a political matter, right, it's probably the case there's going to be a split. There wasn't swaps, right? Swaps was, I think, single name swaps went to SEC, and that was like when you had a basket of less than 10 swaps, and then everything else went to CFTC. And that was a really, CFTC heavy swap move. My guess is that there's some kind of division of labor that's a political choice. But, that contingent upon when the split happens and whether there's not a court case that says, these are always commodities. If that happens, everything changes.
Yeah. And I've talked crypto on here with a guest before, and I really got excited to ask them, is Ethereum a security? But now I guess it's just not as much of a fun of a question, is it?
I think in some ways, right, that was the big kind of reveal of the Hinman emails, is you had all these cases about why they thought Ether wasn't a security, or the cases, but the documents. That came up in the Ripple case too. I tend to think the ship sailed on Ether because of both the things that happened around Ripple, the Ripple case itself. If Ripple's not a security, even hard to argue Ether is.
Right.
And then, just time, right? I mean, the longer we take to get bipartisan legislation, the more the facts are set on the ground. Yeah. That's just the nature of kind of every industry.
I think is where do things go from here? What do you see unfolding over the next few years, both on the the judicial and the legislative front, and maybe even regulatory front?
So the next big thing I'm watching is this Grayscale decision, which is about whether or not the SEC improperly denied an ETF, an exchange traded fund application for a Bitcoin ETF. That was argued in DC Circuit orally on March 7th. And so that case could come any day now. It was surprising. People thought that was going to be SEC winning, because it's very hard to win those cases. But the betting line, I think, from Bloomberg ETF is like 75% chance Grayscale wins, because the judges, even the two Democratic judges, including Srinivasan, who was the chief judge, one Republican, and the judges overall were quite hostile to the SEC because the SEC had approved this like Bitcoin futures ETF, and they were saying, if you did that, why can't you do this?
Right, exactly.
That's the first.
The idea that you can't surveil the market seems a bit silly when you say it's okay with futures, but not the underlying.
I mean, yeah, it is, again, judges work by analogy. They're saying, well, if you do this, then that, right? And that's, policy doesn't work that way. You can just make a decision. So that's one thing. There's this markup happening next week on McHenry Thompson, and people have a chance who are in both the Ag Committee and the Financial Services Committee offer amendments. And so, the amendments are unlimited. You can go to a member that is your congressman, and they can offer hundreds of amendments if they wanted to, right? So that's, the next kind of step. And we're going to see what happens there. I tend to think the odds are not favorable that legislation is going to pass in a big way because people are still digesting this decision. They're still trying to figure out what crypto means. But I think also you're going to see more cases, more decisions come down, probably more SEC losses, all things considered. And then we're going to move toward a realization that others have found of like, okay, it's time now for, legislation. It's time to, get moving and solve this for everything. And that's in some ways, right. We're doing, that would be doing what other countries have done. The EU did their MiCA, markets and crypto asset legislation last year. That's taking effect. The UK passed something. They're doing something. Japan did this years ago. Hong Kong is taking a couple of steps. The US is kind of the slower runner, but that's kind of what we do, right? The great
we see it with everything.
America can always be counted on to do the right thing after exhausted all other options. And that's our superpower. Exactly. We always, take the last minute possible, and then we get things right. So, I mean, I tend to think we're going to get there. I definitely have seen a lot of people who previously were like, I don't want to do anything. It's like, okay, now with this case, it's time. We need to come together and figure out how we're going to do this because it's too important to just keep pushing, down the line.
All right. Well, look, this has been a great conversation. So I definitely appreciate you coming on, helping to explain these very difficult concepts to our audience, and definitely hope to have you back again when,
my pleasure.
Another thing to talk about. So again, thank you, Justin from Paradigm, and really appreciate your time and your insight. And so to our listeners, again, thank you for listening. I hope you appreciated this overview of the Ripple decision, some talking about Keanu Reeves' best movies, and, of course, our requisite weather conversation to start off the podcast. Like I said last time, as the late great Bob Barker said, have your pets spayed or neutered, adopt your animals, don't shop, and subscribe, and hope to have you back again next week. And we don't know what we're covering next week, so maybe throw some ideas at us, and we'll see if anything sticks. So thanks again, Justin.
Thanks, Dave.
Everyone, for listening.
Appreciate it.